Namaste everyone, I'm your co-host Shawnee ma'am. Welcome to your favorite learning channel. The topic for today's video is sexual reproduction in plants. So we had already studied that plants can reproduce both by asexual as well as sexual means. So in our previous video we saw that pollination is a process where the pollen grains were transferred from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower. Okay, so the sexual reproduction actually takes place after the pollination. So what happens after pollination? There is a process called fertilization that occurs after pollination. So we can say that after the process of pollination we had studied in our previous video, what happens is fertilization takes place. Fertilization takes place. Okay, so what happens after reaching the stigma? The event of fertilization starts. Okay, so we can say that the different steps of fertilization can be as follows. Let's see what are these steps. So what happens first? The anther actually consists of pollen grains, correct? We had studied this. So the anther consists of what? Pollen grains. Okay, this we had already studied. Now what happens is when actually the anther matures, so after the maturation of what? Of anthers. So what happens after the maturation of anther? After the maturation of anther, what happens? The anther breaks. Okay, so upon maturation the anther breaks, and this leads to the release of, this releases what? It releases a yellow colored powdery pollen grains. Okay, so pollen grains are only released when the anther gets matured, then the anther breaks and then releases the pollen grains, which are yellow colored powdery substance. Then what happens? Now the pollen grains, they reach pistil. These pollen grains that got released, pollen grains, they reach the pistil of the flower. We know pistil is the female part of the flower. We also know that anther is the male part of the flower. So anther, after maturation, after it breaks, the pollen grains from the anther then reach the pistil of female flower. Okay, and this happens by the process of what? It happens by the process of pollination. Now what happens next? So this pollen grain then sticks to the stigma. These pollen grains, they stick to the stigma of pistil. We had already seen that pistil had three parts: stigma, style and ovary. So stigma is one of the parts of the pistil. So these pollen grains stick to stigma of the pistil, which is sticky in nature. Okay, then what happens? From the stigma, pollen enters the style. Okay, so from the stigma it enters the style. Now what is style? Style is actually a long tube that connects. It is a long tube. What does it do? It connects stigma to the ovary. Okay, so ovary is the basal part of the pistil, and this stigma is connected to ovary with the help of this style, which is a long tube. Okay, so next what happens is, so through the style, or with the help of style, what happens? The pollen, it reaches the egg and it fuses with it. Okay, so pollen grains are getting fused with the egg and they reach the egg with the help of style. Okay, and this results in what? It results in the process of fertilization. Okay, so fertilization is a process where the egg cell, that is the female gamete, fuses with the male gamete. Okay, here fusion takes place between the pollen grains and the egg cell. Okay, so this results in fertilization. So the fertilization is taking place after pollination is completed. So now what happens after fertilization? After fertilization, what happens is the ovary, it develops into a fruit, and the ovules, they develop into seed. Okay, so this happens after fertilization. Now let's see some of the events that take place after fertilization. So these events, we can call them as post-fertilization events. Okay, so what happens after fertilization, we are going to discuss in this section. So after fertilization, after the process of fertilization, there many changes take place in the flower. So what are these changes? Many changes occur. So these changes occur in a flower. Okay, so what happens? The fertilized egg, it forms an embryo. Okay, so this embryo is surrounded by a nutritive tissue. And what is this nutritive tissue called? It is called the endosperm. Okay, so what is the function of endosperm? It provides nutrients to the developing embryo. What does it do? It provides nutrients. It provides the required nutrients. Okay, so it provides the nutrients to the developing embryo. Okay, so this is the function performed by endosperm. Now let's quickly revise the things that we have studied today. So we discussed about the sexual reproduction that takes place in plants. So after pollination, there is a process called fertilization that takes place in case of plants. Okay, so what is the first step? First, what happens is, these are the steps of fertilization or sexual reproduction, we can say. In fertilization, what happens first? Before the fertilization process, pollination takes place. So what happens? Anther, it consists of pollen grains, we had already studied. So when the anther matures, the anther actually breaks, and after it breaks, it releases a yellow colored powdery substance called pollen grains. So these pollen grains, they get transferred from the anther, that is the male part of the flower, to the pistil, that is to the female flower or female part of the flower, and this process is called pollination. This we had already studied. So after the process of pollination starts the process of fertilization, which is a part of sexual reproduction. So now that pollen grains have been transferred from the male part of the flower to the female flower or female part of the flower by pollination, these pollen grains, they stick to the stigma of pistil, and further from the stigma the pollen grains enter the style. Now what is style? Style is a long tube, and this style helps in connecting the stigma to the ovary. So ovary is actually the basal part of the pistil, and stigma gets connected to the ovary with the help of this style, which is a long tube like structure. So through the style, pollen grains actually reach the egg, and then they fuse with it, and this process or this fusion results in the process of fertilization. After fertilization, what happens? The ovary develops into fruit and the ovules develop into seed. Then we discussed few events that take place after fertilization, and we called it post-fertilization events. So what happens after fertilization? Many changes take place in a flower. So fertilized egg, that is the egg that has been fused with the pollen grain, such fertilized egg actually forms an embryo, and this embryo actually gets surrounded by what? It gets surrounded by nutritive tissue, and this nutritive tissue is called endosperm. So what does this endosperm do? Endosperm actually provides nutrients. It provides very essential nutrients required by the developing embryo. So the developing embryo receives all its nutrition from this endosperm, okay, that surrounds the embryo. So I hope you all would have got some great insights by watching today's video. Please do not forget to like and share the video. Till then, thank you for watching.